This lecture, perhaps you've been assigned a research project where you are investigating the postmodern and contemporary approach to appropriation. Or maybe you're just watching this video because you're interested in learning more about Twombly, which either way, good job. Now for this assignment, you were assigned an artist and an artwork that they appropriated from an earlier well-known work of art. To demonstrate how to go about this assignment, I've assigned myself Twombly's School of Athens, which appropriates Raphael's School of Athens, which we can see here. Now, I'm actually pretty excited about this. I've always been really into Twombly's painting of the School of Athens for some reason, but I don't know as much as I should or want to. And so this is a good excuse for me to remedy this situation. Now, how you want to structure things, that's up to you. But here what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with talking just a little bit about the original work of art. Now, just a little bit because there are limitations to how much you can address within this assignment. And the other thing is the assignment really is about Twombly's piece, not so much about Raphael's piece. So what I'm going to do, and I think this is a pretty sound strategy if you want to approach this in a similar way as well, is when I discuss Raphael's School of Athens, which I'm really just doing to provide a context for Twombly's work, I'm going to focus on the aspects of Raphael's piece that relate to Twombly's appropriation. So the School of Athens is a painting that was made by the high Renaissance Italian artist Raphael, and he made this painting to adorn the papal library of Pope Julius II. Now recall that this was one of 4 paintings, one for each wall, each one representing a branch of learning as it was understood in the Western world during this time. These 4 branches are theology, justice, poetry, and philosophy. And School of Athens, which we see here, is addressing philosophy. Now in this work, the setting is not a school per se, but more so a congregation of great philosophers and scientists of the ancient world. And we see them congregating here. They're sharing their ideas, they're conversing as a means to collectively understand the complexities of the world around them. But it's not completely out in left field to keep in mind this idea of a school, perhaps more as we understand school, because this painting, Raphael's painting, was very much about education and intellectualism. And it's this last point, this idea of education and intellectualism, that provides an apt transition to Twombly's version of Raphael's School of Athens. Now, appropriation is complicated, okay? For us to just simply sit here and be like, oh, this is an homage, right? He painted this to just celebrate Raphael, celebrate his School of Athens. That's a little too simplistic. And, you probably are getting the sense of this, that, art historians, we're not into the overly simple. We like to take the hard way. We also argue there's no such thing as a coincidence, right? So it's probably there's a little bit more behind the intent of appropriating a piece than simply the artist likes it. Now, this is the case here with Twombly's piece. This is by no means an attempt to sort of celebrate the artistic genius of Raphael. And in fact, regarding Raphael, Twombly said, and I quote, that Raphael was the most boring painter I know, aside from some portraits. I am loving the honesty here. And I'm just going to say, I'm not disagreeing with Twombly on this point. So this leads us to the first question, okay? If this artwork is not an homage, then what is Twombly trying to say by using appropriation? Now, in the instructions for this assignment, you've been asked to limit biographical information unless it's relevant to the interpretation of the artwork that you've been assigned. So I'm following my own instructions, but I do have some relevant details that I can provide that will help contextualize Twombly's work. Not just his School of Athens, but some of the other artwork that I'm going to be addressing in this presentation as well. So Twombly is an American artist. In 1953, he served in the U.S. Army as a cryptologist, and this involves the writing and breaking of codes. Now, what does this involve inherently? The knowledge of linguistic systems, language. Twombly's familiarity with the nuanced complexities of language wasn't just limited to his stint with the Army. He was also a poet. Now, someone who is very much into poetry, I tried to find one of his poems as a treat for you to read as part of this presentation, but alas, they're very hard to find. I couldn't find anything. But I found a book that I did not get to in time for this presentation. It's called Reading Cy Twombly, Poetry and Paint by Mary Jacobus. I suggest reading this book if you want to know more. I certainly am going to do that when I have time to just read a book. Now, Twombly, he wrote poetry, but more so he was an avid reader of it, especially the older poets, like the complete and total boss Sappho, who was this female poet who wrote this incredible erotic poetry back in the times of classical Greece, which that altogether is very rare, that combination. And poets such as Sappho were a strong inspiration for much of Twombly's work. Now, in 1957, Twombly relocates permanently to Rome, and this is where he likely became familiar with, or even more familiar with, Raphael's School of Athens. Because remember, this is in Rome, it's at the Vatican, it's in the papal apartments. It was also during this time that he began a series of works known as writings, which were essentially this sort of calligraphic style of mark making on canvas. And we can see both of these works are an example of this type of work known as writings. Now let's just address what some of you may be thinking right now, that these are just scribbles and anyone can do this. Don't you dare think such a thing about Twombly's work. First of all, there's a level of improvisation here. It's by no means sloppy doodles. First, Twombly studied under the much celebrated artist / composer / musician John Cage, who was interested in the intersection between music and dance. And music, in its own way, is a language. We can see Cage's influence in Twombly's work. This idea of the experience, and it's an experience that's not premeditated. This idea that art is detached, or can be to a certain extent detached from the intention of the artist. This is very much in the spirit of happenings, which we will learn about when we study performance art later in the semester, or maybe you've already studied it wherever you're at in watching these lectures. So what he's doing is he's privileging chance. And this is what accounts for this gestural mark making. Carefully rendered realistic imagery, it wouldn't successfully convey this idea. But if you look at it, there's something really intense about these insistent scribbles. One that makes his work really, I would say, a sophisticated examination between the link that exists between thinking and feeling. These are not just thoughtless marks. Look close. You can see that he really understands the formal element of line. And you know what? Not just anyone understands that. Not just anyone can do what you see here. So what is Twombly trying to say here by appropriating Raphael's School of Athens, which, by the way, I learned when researching for this presentation that he made two versions of this appropriation. Now, for many postmodern and contemporary artists, the whole point of using the strategy of appropriation is to level some sort of critique. This is very much in the spirit of the time. During this time, artists are pushing back against concepts regarding universal truths and objective reality. Now, when you're researching your own artist, I strongly suggest you look into the possibility of critique, especially as it's going to relate to race or gender or sexuality or class or the discipline of art history or some of these things or all of these things. Now, Twombly, he's a little early. Okay, he's sort of on the cusp of postmodernism, so he's not quite doing this critique sort of approach. not necessarily critiquing anything. But let me tell you what Twombly is trying to do, and I'm going to use his own words here. This is a direct quote. Here's what Twombly says. What I'm trying to establish is that modern art isn't dislocated, but something with roots, tradition, and continuity. For myself, the past is the source. So, like most all works of appropriation, he's undertaking this strategy to give the work of art its meaning, right? He's exploiting appropriation's reliance on the visual reference. Now, what I mean by that is he's exploiting the fact that we're going to look at his piece and we're going to see within it the School of Athens, right? That he's sort of citing his sources, so to speak. He's making it clear that his work of art is coming from something that was made previously, right? Now, you might say, well, I don't see that. And probably not. I get that. You can kind of see it if you look. You can see similar shapes here that, evoke this, is evocative of this vaulting structure. This sort of elliptical-like motion here, which mimics the implied lines that create the elliptical moving in here as well. So there's similar compositional structuring that's happening here, right? So what Twombly's trying to do by appropriating Raphael's School of Athens is he's trying to make connections across time regarding the expression of intellectual thought. And then he's, looking at this through these notions of philosophy, through the way that intellectual thought was embodied in things like the geometric rationalism of ancient Greek architecture, which we can see in here, right? Or things like intellectualism in a more abstract form, which we can see in things such as written and spoken language. Now, what he's also doing is he's advocating for modern art. So he's doing something here, okay? Again, not like doodly scribbles for no reason. He may not be leveling a critique, which many of these artists who use appropriation is doing, but he's definitely making a statement. And, what he's saying is that we might want to rethink what tends to be a dismissiveness or perhaps even an antagonism towards aesthetic simplicity. And what did I even just say? Here's what I am saying, right? When you're looking at works of art that are really distilled down to non-representation, that they're limited to line or color or shape or even a very extensive abstraction, this is something that people kind of push against because they don't understand it. And this is where that whole idea of, there's no skill involved or a 4-year-old can do it, which both of those things are patently untrue, goes back to the argument that I was saying, that these are not meaningless doodle scribbles, but that he is making the argument that what you're seeing here, even though it doesn't look the same, that actually it's part of an acknowledged and well-established tradition, one that stems back to the intellectualism that was characteristic of the Renaissance. It's not just referencing the visual aspects of the High Renaissance with the School of Athens, but there's a conceptual aspect to this well because he's also making a reference towards humanism, this time of learning and studying, and writing and observing. These are all virtuous endeavors that Twombly too extols. And it's not just with this work, but with most of the ones that he created. Let me show you a couple of examples. Now, one of the things you might want to think about is whether or not your artist appropriated other artworks, right? And if so, what's the intent behind that? How does that factor into the wider messages that your artist is trying to communicate? Now, one thing I learned when I was doing research for this presentation is that actually appropriation does factor in fairly often, I would say, to Twombly's work. I did not know that, right? This is like the presentation where the gifts are they keep on giving, right? So here's an example. This is an appropriation of another one of Raphael's works. And here's another example. He also appropriated work by the French Baroque artist Poussin. And I think with both of these examples, this one as well as this one, that Twombly's trying to do the same thing as his School of Athens appropriation, where he's locating his work within a specific art historical tradition, one that is predicated upon an intellectual approach to both one's understanding of the world around him, but also an intellectual approach to art making. Remember, the French Baroque approach, at least in its more academic approach, which Poussin was very much a part of, was highly influenced by classicism. So French Baroque, as well as the High Renaissance, they were both focused, as these sort of like classical revival styles, focused on re-articulating these very cerebral themes that were informed by humanism. Twombly takes these ideas that are expressed by Raphael and Poussin, and he contemporizes them. He locates them within a distinctly modern context, and this is the point, a very distinctly modern aesthetic. By moving away from the representational, the work instead becomes conceptual. The ideas within this work are what make the art art. The lines, the colors, they're simply the vehicle to communicate the ideas. It's so good. Marcel Duchamp is like looking down from the afterlife, shedding a tear of pride to see someone, the likes of Cy Twombly, working with these ideas, that his legacy lives on in such a great way. Now, in my research, I also read that Twombly appropriated Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which I was really interested in that. And I figured, you might be interested in that as well. The piece is called Garden of Sudden Delight, but unfortunately I couldn't find an image of it to show you here. He also made an appropriation of the Birth of Venus, which I'm assuming, which we never should assume, but I'm going to, I'm assuming that this is an appropriation of the early Renaissance artist Botticelli's version. Here's some more examples of Twombly's work. Now, from a stylistic standpoint, his appropriations are very much in line with the other work that he was making, particularly his early works, before he began to go into this more literal approach where he would incorporate numbers and more legible text, like, for example, the work on the left. The appropriations that I mentioned in this presentation, they're also in line with his work in general, in that most of what he created was inspired by poetry, as I had mentioned, as well as history and Greco-Roman myth. And we can see both in the examples here. You've got a reference to the Roman god Bacchus on the left, and a reference to one of the bad boys of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Commodus, on the right. So we can also see that Rome continues to have an influence on his work. Now, putting together your project, your research, you have a lot of freedom in terms of how you want to structure your presentation. You don't have to do things the way that I've done them here. I'm just trying to provide you with an example. Now, what you want to make sure, though, you do is that you at least are meeting the minimum requirements of the assignment. And if you want to go beyond this, you can. And in fact, I encourage you to do so. And for me, for funsies, I'm just going to add in a little something extra that I learned about Twombly when I was doing my research. And that is that Twombly is an incredible sculptor. I seriously did not even know that he made sculpture at all, which that's okay. A little embarrassing, but in my own defense, my area of specialty is the ancient world, the Aegean, so I'm not going to know everything about modern art. Also in my defense, not a lot of scholarly attention is given to his sculptures versus his paintings. And I think that ranks up there as one of the biggest tragedies of all time, because you can see these sculptures are amazing. Now, here's a couple of examples, right? Like his two-dimensional works, his paintings, his drawings, his sculptures have a very distinct appearance. There is a consistency. Most of the sculptures that I'm showing in this presentation, they date to the late 1980s, the early 1990s, and they tend to consist of found object constructions and assemblages that are painted white. He calls the white his marble, so a nod once again to classicism. The white also functions to establish a complicated system of reference. He's looking at interrelationships. For example, the relationships between the individual objects and the relationship between these objects individually with the piece in its entirety. Let's look at some more examples. What I really like about his interrelationships is the way that he really privileges shape. Shapes can be underrated sometimes, maybe overlooked. But here, shapes, this is really the focus. And these shapes are so visually compelling to me. They're elegant. There's something that I find beautiful in their imperfection and their rough surface. They're so simple, but there's something kind of intricate and complicated about them as well. And that's one thing that always really gets me personally as a viewer, is when you've got this juxtaposition of opposites. It really does it for me intellectually. This idea of having, for example, simple yet complicated sort of residing one next to the other. I have even more examples. I like the all white personally, because I think it emphasizes the details, which is something that we tend to overlook. Things like, for example, the way that this drip builds up here on the side, the slight angle of this piece right in here to give it kind of this dynamic feeling, or maybe a sense of tension. The pattern that the paint makes down in here, this kind of linear pattern. This is great. This triangular piece that's kind of shoved in here, creating this sense of imbalance. You have these more geometric forms. The rigidity is a contrast against these rounded curvilinear forms. This is like my favorite right in here. So dynamic. These curves, this extension up into space. The way that these interact with the space. To me, it really heightens the three-dimensionality of these objects. It's so good. Now, as an art historian, people always ask me, who's your favorite artist? And that's a really hard question for me to answer because it's always changing. Now, if you ask me today, who's my favorite artist? Many of you might say, oh, it's probably Giotto, right? And that's a good guess. But actually, if you ask me today, who's your favorite artist, my answer would be Twombly. And then your follow-up question might be, well, why? Why is he your favorite artist? And this is my answer to you. Because he's a badass, obviously.